How far would you go to protect what matters most? Henry Walker awakens in the ICU to discover a chilling truth: his own family is plotting to seize his wealth. Desperate to uncover their true intentions, Henry fakes his own death, setting off a chain of events that will test the very fabric of their relationships. As Henry delves deeper into the deception, he finds himself torn between love and betrayal. Can he confront his family and find a way to rebuild their trust, or will the weight of their actions prove too heavy to bear? The ICU hummed with the sterile rhythm of beeping monitors and the soft rustle of nurses moving swiftly through the hallways. Henry Walker's eyes fluttered open, the harsh fluorescent lights above piercing through the haze of his consciousness. He blinked several times, trying to adjust to the stark white room and the antiseptic scent that filled the air. His chest ached, a constant reminder of the heart attack that had landed him here. Henry shifted slightly, wincing as the movement sent a jolt of pain through his frail body. At 75, he had seen his share of health scares, but this one felt different. It felt like a warning, a sign that time was no longer on his side. He tried to focus on the sounds around him, grounding himself in the present moment. That's when he heard it, a muffled conversation just outside his room. "You don't understand, Mom. If we don't act now, we'll lose everything." The voice was urgent, almost panicked. Henry recognized it immediately: his grandson, Tom. Henry's curiosity was piqued. Tom was a bright young man, ambitious and driven, much like Henry had been in his youth. But what could have driven him to such desperation? He strained to hear more, his senses sharpening as adrenaline began to surge through his veins. He could make out his daughter Susan's voice, calm but firm. "Tom, we need to think this through. Rushing into things won't help us." Henry's mind raced as he tried to piece together what they were talking about. Investments gone wrong? Debts? He had always prided himself on providing for his family, ensuring they never had to face the struggles he had in his early years. What could have gone so wrong? Tom's voice broke through his thoughts. "Mom, I'm telling you, this is our only chance. If we don't do something now, Grandpa's money will be tied up, and we won't see a cent." Henry's heart skipped a beat. His money? What were they planning? As the conversation continued, Henry closed his eyes, pretending to be asleep when Susan and Tom entered his room. He felt a pang of guilt for eavesdropping, but he needed to know what was happening. "Is he awake?" Tom whispered. "No, he's still out," Susan replied softly. "The doctors said he needs rest." Henry's breathing remained steady, though his mind was anything but calm. He listened as Tom and Susan talked in hushed tones, discussing financial troubles, debts that had piled up, and a desperate plan to secure his wealth. The more he heard, the more a sense of betrayal and dread settled over him. Tom's voice wavered, betraying his anxiety. "We can't afford to wait. If we don't act, the creditors will come after us. We need to get control of Grandpa's assets now." Susan sighed, her tone resigned. "I know, Tom. But what you're suggesting, it's risky. If anything goes wrong." "It won't," Tom interrupted. "It has to work." Henry's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He had always trusted his family, believed in their integrity. But now, he realized he might have been blind to their true nature. Were they really considering something so drastic, so underhanded, just to secure his money? As the conversation wound down and Tom and Susan left the room, Henry's heart ached not just from his physical condition but from the emotional toll of what he had just heard. He needed to think, to plan. This wasn't something he could confront them about directly, not yet, anyway. He needed to understand the full extent of their intentions. The hours passed slowly in the ICU, each minute stretching into eternity. Nurses came and went, checking his vitals, adjusting his medications. Henry lay still, his mind racing with possibilities. He needed an ally, someone he could trust implicitly. His thoughts turned to Richard, his longtime friend and personal attorney. Richard had been by his side through countless business deals, always ensuring Henry's interests were protected. If anyone could help him navigate this situation, it was Richard. Later that evening, as the hospital quieted down, Henry requested a visit from Richard. He knew he had to be discreet. The walls of the hospital felt like they had ears. When Richard arrived, his face a mask of concern, Henry felt a small measure of relief. "Henry, my friend, how are you holding up?" Richard asked, pulling up a chair beside the bed. Henry forced a weak smile. "I've been better, Richard. But I need your help, and your discretion." Richard's expression grew serious. "Of course, Henry. What's going on?" Henry recounted the snippets of conversation he had overheard, his voice barely above a whisper. As he spoke, he watched Richard's face shift from concern to shock to a steely determination. "You think they're planning to, what, Henry? Take your money?" Richard asked, incredulous. Henry nodded slowly. "It sounds like they're desperate, Richard. Desperate enough to do something drastic." Richard leaned back, processing the information. "This is serious, Henry. If they're truly in as much trouble as it sounds, they might do something reckless." Henry sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I need to know what they're planning, Richard. And I need to protect my interests. But I can't do it alone." Richard nodded, his mind already working through potential strategies. "We'll need to be careful, Henry. Gather evidence, understand their full intentions before we act. But rest assured, we will get to the bottom of this." Henry felt a glimmer of hope. With Richard by his side, he had a fighting chance. They discussed the next steps in hushed tones, crafting a plan to uncover the truth while protecting Henry's legacy. As the night wore on and Richard took his leave, Henry lay back, his mind still racing but now with a sense of purpose. He would uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. And he would protect his family's future, even if it meant facing the possibility of betrayal from those he loved most. In the quiet of the ICU, Henry Walker resolved to fight back. His journey was just beginning, and he knew it would not be an easy one. But for the sake of his legacy, and the values he held dear, he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The sun filtered weakly through the ICU windows the next morning, casting a pale light on the sterile room. Henry Walker lay in his hospital bed, the events of the previous day still fresh in his mind. His body was weak, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He needed to uncover the full extent of Tom and Susan's plans without arousing their suspicion. As the nurse came in to check his vitals, Henry put on a weary smile. "Good morning," he greeted her softly. "Good morning, Mr. Walker. How are you feeling today?" she asked, her tone professional yet kind. "A bit better, thank you," Henry replied. "Could you tell me if my daughter and grandson have arrived yet? I believe they plan to visit me today." The nurse glanced at the chart in her hand. "Yes, they're here. Would you like me to send them in?" "Please," Henry said, his smile faltering slightly as he prepared himself for the upcoming interaction. A few moments later, the door opened and Susan entered, followed closely by Tom. Susan's face lit up with a practiced smile, but Tom's eyes darted around the room, betraying his anxiety. "Dad, you're looking better today," Susan said, leaning in to kiss his forehead. Henry returned the gesture, then turned his attention to Tom. "Hello, Tom. How are you holding up?" Tom managed a tight smile. "Just worried about you, Grandpa. We've all been very concerned." Henry nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched his grandson's expressions. "I appreciate that. But worrying doesn't solve anything. We need to think clearly and make plans." Susan exchanged a glance with Tom before turning back to Henry. "Of course, Dad. We're here to support you in any way we can." Henry felt a pang of sadness mixed with suspicion. Could they really be planning something behind his back? He needed more information. "I've been thinking about my affairs," he began carefully. "I want to make sure everything is in order, just in case. Have either of you spoken to Richard lately?" Tom's eyes flickered with something. Was it fear? Before he quickly masked it. "No, we haven't. Why do you ask? I'd like to have a meeting with him, Henry said, watching their reactions closely. There are some details I need to discuss, and I want to ensure my will and estate are secure. Susan's face remained neutral, but Henry noticed the slight tension in her posture. That's a good idea, Dad. We'll arrange for Richard to come by as soon as possible. Thank you, Henry replied, forcing a smile. In the meantime, I'd like to rest. This recovery is taking more out of me than I expected. Susan and Tom left the room, their whispered conversation picking up as soon as the door closed behind them. Henry's heart ached with the weight of uncertainty. Were they genuinely concerned, or were they hiding something more sinister? Later that day, Richard arrived, his presence a welcome relief for Henry. They spoke in low tones, careful to ensure their conversation remained private. I've been thinking, Richard, Henry began once they were alone. I need to understand what Tom and Susan are planning. I overheard them discussing my money and how they need it urgently. I fear they might be desperate enough to do something reckless. Richard frowned, his brow furrowing in concern. We need to tread carefully, Henry. If they're indeed plotting something, we must gather solid evidence before making any moves. Henry nodded. I agree. But how do we do that without them noticing? Richard thought for a moment. We'll need to set a trap, something that will force them to reveal their intentions. But first, we need more information. I suggest you continue to play the part of the unaware patient. Let them think you're none the wiser. Meanwhile, I'll do some digging on their financial status and recent activities. Henry sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. It pains me to think they could be capable of such betrayal. But I need to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Over the next few days, Henry followed Richard's advice. He played the role of the recovering patient, smiling weakly when Susan and Tom visited, listening carefully to their conversations without revealing his growing suspicions. Susan was careful, her words always measured and supportive, but there was a tension in her eyes that Henry hadn't noticed before. Tom, on the other hand, was more transparent. His anxiety was palpable, and Henry could see the cracks in his facade. One afternoon, while pretending to doze off, Henry overheard Tom and Susan talking in urgent whispers. We need to move quickly, Tom said, his voice barely audible. The creditors are breathing down our necks. If we don't get access to Grandpa's money soon, we're finished. Susan sighed, her frustration evident. I know, Tom. But we can't make any rash decisions. We need to find a way to convince him to sign over control of his assets. If he suspects anything, we're done for. Henry's heart ached with the realization that his fears were justified. They were indeed plotting to take control of his wealth, driven by their own financial desperation. He fought to keep his breathing steady, his mind racing with the implications of their words. As the days passed, Richard began to uncover troubling information. He found evidence of bad investments, mounting debts, and even instances where funds had been misappropriated. The picture was becoming clearer. Tom and Susan were in deep financial trouble, and they saw Henry's wealth as their lifeline. Henry felt a mix of anger and sorrow. He had always prided himself on providing for his family, ensuring they had everything they needed. To think they would betray him in such a way was a bitter pill to swallow. One evening, Richard visited Henry with an update. I've found enough evidence to suggest they're in serious financial trouble. Their debts are overwhelming, and they've made some very poor investment choices. They're desperate, Henry. Desperate people do desperate things. Henry nodded, his resolve hardening. We need to act, Richard. But we need to be smart about it. I want to give them a chance to come clean, to see if there's any remorse. But if they don't... Richard placed a reassuring hand on Henry's shoulder. We'll be ready. Whatever happens, you're not alone in this. With Richard's support, Henry felt a renewed sense of determination. The path ahead was fraught with uncertainty and potential heartbreak, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. He needed to see this through, to protect his legacy and ensure that justice was served. As he lay back in his hospital bed, the beeping of the monitors a steady reminder of his fragile state, Henry vowed to uncover the truth. The days of uncertainty and doubt were drawing to a close. The time for answers was near, and Henry was prepared to face whatever revelations lay ahead. The early morning light cast a soft glow through the curtains of Henry Walker's hospital room. He lay awake, his mind churning with the revelations of the past few days. His family's betrayal cut deep, and he knew he had to take decisive action to protect his legacy. He needed to confront the situation head-on, but he couldn't do it alone. As Henry pondered his next steps, the door creaked open and Richard walked in, his expression a mix of concern and determination. "Morning, Henry," he greeted, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" Henry sighed, the weight of his thoughts heavy on his chest. "I've been better, Richard. But I've made a decision. It's drastic, but I believe it's the only way to truly understand what Tom and Susan are planning." Richard leaned forward, curiosity etched on his face. "What's on your mind, Henry?" Henry took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I want to fake my own death. If they believe I'm gone, they'll reveal their true intentions. We'll see how far they're willing to go." Richard's eyes widened in shock. "Henry, that's a bold move. Are you sure about this?" "It's risky, and it'll require meticulous planning." "I've thought about it long and hard," Henry replied, his voice resolute. "It's the only way to see their true colors without tipping them off. But I need your help to make it happen." Richard nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation. "All right, Henry. If this is what you truly want, we'll make it work. We need to ensure everything is airtight. The fewer people who know, the better." Henry felt a glimmer of hope. With Richard by his side, he knew he could pull this off. "We'll need to involve a trusted nurse. Someone who can help us manage the logistics within the hospital." Richard thought for a moment. "I know just the person. Maria has been with the hospital for years, and she's someone I trust completely. Let me speak with her and see if she's willing to help." The next few days passed in a blur of hushed conversations and careful planning. Maria agreed to help, her loyalty to Henry and Richard unwavering. Together, they crafted a plan to stage Henry's death convincingly. Every detail was scrutinized, ensuring there would be no loose ends. On the appointed day, Maria prepared the necessary paperwork and medications, her demeanor calm and professional. Richard stood by, his expression tense but focused. "Are you ready, Henry?" Maria asked gently, her eyes reflecting a mixture of concern and determination. Henry nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "As ready as I'll ever be. Let's do this." Maria administered the medication, a carefully calculated dose that would mimic the symptoms of a fatal heart attack without causing any real harm. Henry felt his body relax, his vision blurring as the drug took effect. He closed his eyes, trusting in his friends to see the plan through. Moments later, the alarms on Henry's monitors began to beep frantically. Maria sprang into action, calling for help and initiating the emergency protocols. Doctors and nurses rushed in, their faces grim as they attempted to revive Henry. Richard stood back, his expression one of controlled panic, playing his part convincingly. Despite their best efforts, Henry was pronounced dead. His body was quietly transported to a secure location, where he would wait while Richard and Maria executed the next phase of their plan. Back at the hospital, the news of Henry's death spread quickly. Susan and Tom arrived, their faces pale and drawn. Susan's eyes filled with tears as she clung to Tom, who wore a mask of shock and grief. "We did everything we could," Richard said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "But it was his time. I'm so sorry." Susan sobbed, her shoulders shaking with grief. Tom's reaction was more controlled, but Henry, watching through hidden cameras, noted the flicker of something in his eyes, relief, perhaps? Or was it satisfaction? Over the next few days, Richard kept Henry informed about the family's actions. Tom and Susan wasted no time in contacting lawyers and financial advisors, eager to secure control of Henry's assets. Their desperation was palpable, and Henry's suspicions were confirmed. One evening, as Henry sat in his hidden location, Richard arrived with an update. "They're moving quickly, Henry. They've already contacted your financial advisors and are pushing to expedite the transfer of assets. They're not wasting any time." Henry nodded, his resolve hardening. "We need to gather more evidence. If they're willing to act so quickly, there's a good chance they'll slip up. We need to catch them in the act." Richard agreed. "We'll monitor their communications closely. I've already set up surveillance on their phones and emails. We'll have the evidence we need soon." The days dragged on, each one bringing more revelations about Tom and Susan's plans. They discussed ways to circumvent legal hurdles, their conversations growing more reckless as their desperation increased. Henry felt a mix of anger and sadness. He had always believed in the goodness of his family, but their actions revealed a darker side he had never imagined. He wondered how he could have been so blind, so trusting. Finally, the breakthrough came. Richard intercepted an email from Tom to a financial advisor, detailing a plan to forge documents and access Henry's offshore accounts. It was the smoking gun they needed. Richard brought the evidence to Henry, his expression triumphant. "We've got them, Henry. This email is enough to initiate a full investigation. They've incriminated themselves." Henry felt a surge of relief. "It's time to reveal the truth, Richard. Let's bring them to justice." With the evidence in hand, Richard contacted the authorities, setting in motion a legal investigation. Henry prepared himself for the final confrontation, ready to face Tom and Susan with the truth. As the day of reckoning approached, Henry couldn't help but reflect on the journey he had undertaken. He had faced betrayal and deceit, but he had also discovered the strength within himself to fight back. He was ready to confront his family, to demand answers and seek justice. In the sterile light of the hospital room, Henry Walker had made a choice. He had chosen to protect his legacy, to stand up for the values he believed in. And now, as he prepared to confront his betrayers, he knew that he was not alone. He had Richard, Maria, and the truth on his side. The time for deception was over. The truth was about to come to light, and Henry was ready to face whatever lay ahead. Henry Walker watched the sun rise from his secluded hideout, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. It had been weeks since he had died, and the weight of his family's betrayal still sat heavily on his heart. But today was the day he would take the first steps toward revealing the truth. Richard arrived early, his expression a mix of determination and concern. "Morning, Henry. Are you ready?" Henry nodded, his resolve unwavering. "Yes, Richard. It's time to bring this to an end." The plan was set in motion with meticulous precision. Richard had arranged for a private investigator to shadow Tom and Susan, collecting evidence of their fraudulent activities. The investigator had documented meetings, recorded conversations, and gathered enough proof to ensure their actions could no longer be hidden. Richard handed Henry a folder, thick with documents. "This is everything we've gathered. It's more than enough to initiate legal proceedings. But first, we need to confront them and give them a chance to explain themselves." Henry looked at the folder, his heart heavy. "I never wanted it to come to this, Richard. But I can't let them get away with what they've done." Richard placed a reassuring hand on Henry's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing, Henry. They need to be held accountable. Let's head to the house. It's time." As they drove to the Walker family estate, Henry's mind was a whirlwind of memories and emotions. He recalled family gatherings, moments of joy, and the love he had once felt so strongly for Tom and Susan. How had it all gone so wrong? They arrived at the estate, the grand house standing as a silent witness to the unfolding drama. Henry took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. Inside, Tom and Susan were in the study, their faces tense as they pored over documents. They looked up, shocked, as Henry and Richard entered. "Dad!" Susan gasped, her face paling. "What? How?" Tom's expression was a mix of fear and anger. "Grandpa, we thought you were dead?" Henry finished for him, his voice cold. "I know. That was the plan, wasn't it?" Susan's eyes filled with tears. "Dad, we can explain. Please, let us explain." Henry held up a hand, silencing her. "I've heard enough. Richard and I have been gathering evidence of your activities since I overheard your conversation in the hospital. I know about the debts, the bad investments, and the plan to access my money." Tom stepped forward, his face contorted with desperation. "Grandpa, we were just trying to save the family. We didn't want to hurt you." "Hurt me?" Henry's voice trembled with emotion. "You were willing to let me die to save yourselves. You betrayed everything I believed in, everything I worked for." Richard handed the folder to Henry, who placed it on the table in front of Tom and Susan. "This is all the evidence we've collected. You have one chance to come clean, to explain yourselves, before we hand this over to the authorities." Susan sobbed, her shoulders shaking. "Dad, we were desperate. The debts were overwhelming. We didn't know what else to do." Henry's heart ached, torn between his love for his family and the betrayal he felt. "Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you ask for help?" Tom's anger flared. "Because we knew you'd never understand. You always preached about hard work and integrity, but that wasn't enough. We needed more, and you wouldn't give it to us." Henry shook his head, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I would have helped you, Tom. I would have done anything for you both. But you chose to deceive me instead." Richard stepped forward, his voice firm. "The evidence we have is damning. Fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. If you cooperate, we might be able to mitigate the consequences. But if you continue to deny and deceive, the full weight of the law will come down on you." Susan's sobs grew louder, while Tom's anger seemed to deflate, replaced by a resigned hopelessness. "What do you want us to do?" he asked quietly. Henry took a deep breath, the pain of the moment cutting deep. "I want you to take responsibility for your actions. Admit what you've done, cooperate with the investigation, and face the consequences. It's the only way we can begin to make things right." Tom and Susan looked at each other, their expressions a mix of fear and regret. Finally, Susan nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "We'll do it. We'll cooperate." Henry felt a small measure of relief, though the pain of their betrayal still lingered. "I never wanted it to come to this," he said softly. "But we can't change the past. We can only move forward and try to make things right." The following days were a blur of legal proceedings and difficult conversations. Tom and Susan confessed to their actions, and with Richard's help, they began the process of restitution and cooperation with the authorities. It was a long and painful journey, but it was the only path toward redemption. Throughout it all, Henry remained resolute. He had faced the ultimate betrayal from those he loved most, but he had also found strength within himself to seek the truth and demand justice. The journey had been fraught with pain and heartache, but it had also revealed the resilience of the human spirit. As the sun set on the Walker estate, Henry stood on the porch, looking out over the sprawling grounds. Richard joined him, the two friends standing in companionable silence. "You did the right thing, Henry," Richard said quietly. "It wasn't easy, but you stood up for what you believed in." Henry nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. "I hope they can find a way to redeem themselves. I hope we can find a way to heal." Richard placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. "One step at a time, my friend. One step at a time." As the night descended, Henry felt a sense of peace. The truth had come to light, and justice had been served. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he knew he had the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. With Richard by his side and the love for his family still in his heart, Henry Walker was ready to move forward, one step at a time. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal battles and emotional upheaval for the Walker family. Henry's decision to fake his death and expose his family's betrayal had set in motion a chain of events that forever changed the dynamic of their relationships. Henry spent his days working closely with Richard, gathering the final pieces of evidence and ensuring that Tom and Susan's cooperation with the authorities was thorough. The once robust and unshakable Henry Walker had become more contemplative, his face etched with the lines of recent hardships. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the Walker estate, Henry sat on the porch, lost in thought. The events of the past months played through his mind like a somber melody. The betrayal, the deception, and the heartbreaking realization that his own flesh and blood had seen him more as a means to an end than as a beloved patriarch. Richard joined him, the familiar creak of the porch boards announcing his arrival. He handed Henry a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the last light of the day. "Thought you might need this," he said quietly. Henry accepted the drink with a nod. "Thanks, Richard. It's been a long road." Richard sat down beside him, the two men gazing out over the expansive grounds in silence for a moment. "You've done the right thing, Henry. It's not easy, but you stood up for what's right." Henry sighed, swirling the bourbon in his glass. "It's hard to see it that way sometimes. I feel like I've lost so much." Richard nodded, understanding the weight of Henry's words. "You've lost, but you've also gained clarity. You've seen the truth, no matter how painful. And now, you can start to rebuild." As they sat in companionable silence, the sound of an approaching car broke through the stillness. Henry looked up to see Tom and Susan stepping out, their faces marked with fatigue and remorse. They had been living with the consequences of their actions, and the weight of their decisions had clearly taken its toll. Henry stood, his heart heavy with a mix of emotions. He watched as his daughter and grandson approached, their steps hesitant. "Dad, Grandpa," Susan began, her voice trembling. "We know we can't undo what we've done, but we want to make things right. We're here to face the consequences and to try to rebuild what we've broken." Tom nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. "We've started working with the authorities, and we're committed to paying back every cent we've taken. We're sorry for everything." Henry's eyes softened as he looked at his family. The anger and betrayal he had felt were still there, but they were tempered with a deep love that had never truly faded. "I appreciate that you're taking responsibility," he said, his voice steady. "It's a long road to redemption, but it's one you need to walk if we're ever going to heal." Susan's eyes filled with tears, and she stepped forward, wrapping her arms around her father. "Thank you, Dad. We're so sorry." Henry hugged her tightly, feeling the weight of the past months begin to lift, if only slightly. He turned to Tom, who stood awkwardly, unsure of what to do. Henry reached out, pulling his grandson into a hug as well. "We have a lot to work through," Henry said quietly. "But I'm willing to try if you are." Tom nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "We are, Grandpa. We're ready to make things right." The family sat down together on the porch, the first rays of a new dawn starting to break through the darkness. They talked long into the night, sharing their fears, their regrets, and their hopes for the future. It was a night of raw honesty and tentative steps toward reconciliation. In the following weeks, Henry, Tom, and Susan worked together to address the financial mess that had nearly torn them apart. With Richard's help, they began to repay the debts and make restitution for their wrongdoings. It was a difficult journey, but it was one they walked together, each step bringing them closer to healing. Henry found solace in the small moments of connection with his family. A shared meal, a walk through the gardens, a heartfelt conversation. These were the things that mattered most, the things that money could never buy. One crisp autumn morning, Henry stood at the edge of the estate's pond, watching the leaves drift lazily on the water's surface. Tom joined him, the two men standing side by side in comfortable silence. "Grandpa," Tom began, his voice quiet, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. I know I can't change the past, but I want to be better. I want to earn your trust again." Henry looked at his grandson, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "I believe you, Tom. and I'm willing to give you that chance. We all make mistakes, but it's how we choose to move forward that defines us." Tom nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you, Grandpa. That means a lot to me." As they stood there, watching the sun rise over the pond, Henry felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. The journey had been painful, but it had also brought them closer together. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, ready to build a future based on trust and love. Henry knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, but he also knew that he had the strength and support to face whatever came his way. With his family by his side, he was ready to embrace the future with hope and determination. In the end, it wasn't the wealth or the estate that mattered most. It was the bonds of family, the love and forgiveness that had brought them back from the brink. And as the sun set on the Walker estate, Henry felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey they had taken together. The world was still a place of light and hope, filled with people who cared and loved deeply. And for Henry Walker, that was the greatest legacy of all.